I won't sit next to him, move him now. A first-class cabin falls silent as a powerful man humiliates a quiet passenger, demanding he be removed instantly. But something feels off. The passenger doesn't react, doesn't argue, doesn't even look afraid. And then the crew is called. But 8 minutes later, the purser walks in, and everything changes, because no one on that flight knows who he really is, yet. I won't fly next to him. Move him now. The words cut through the calm of the first-class cabin like something sharp breaking glass that no one expected to shatter. It was not just spoken, it was thrown into the air with authority, frustration, and a confidence that assumed the world would adjust itself immediately in response. For a brief moment, everything inside the cabin froze. The luxury of the aircraft suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Soft golden lighting still washed over polished leather seats. Champagne glasses still rested untouched on tray tables. The quiet hum of boarding still lingered in the background. But now, none of it mattered, because one man had decided another man did not belong. Victor Harlan sat upright in his seat near the window, his jaw locked, his posture rigid with certainty. He was dressed like someone who expected life to cooperate with him, sharp suit, expensive watch catching the cabin light every time he moved, perfectly controlled appearance. Everything about him spoke of status. Everything about him spoke of control. And control, in his mind, was now being threatened by a man who had just taken the seat beside him. Keanu Reeves had not entered the cabin like someone trying to be seen. He moved quietly, almost unnoticed at first, holding a simple black travel bag, dressed in a worn black jacket, a plain shirt, and jeans that did not try to impress anyone. There was no performance in his presence, no attempt to announce importance. Just a calm, grounded way of existing in space, as if the cabin belonged to everyone equally. But that was exactly what Victor could not accept. Keanu stopped beside the row, checked the seat number calmly, and without hesitation stepped into place. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice steady, respectful. Victor did not move immediately. His eyes scanned Keanu from top to bottom in a slow, assessing look that did not hide judgment. It was not recognition. It was something colder. Something deciding value based on appearance alone. Then, reluctantly, he shifted just enough to allow Keanu to pass. Not with kindness. Not with welcome. But with resistance. As if even sharing space had cost him something, Keanu settled into his seat without complaint. He placed his bag beneath the seat, adjusted himself calmly, and looked forward. No frustration. No reaction. No confrontation. But Victor was not finished. He turned slightly, studying him again. The silence between them was not empty, it was already uncomfortable. After a few seconds, Victor finally spoke. "Excuse me." Keanu turned slightly. "Yes?" The tone was calm, almost too calm for what was coming. Victor leaned back just enough to make his point feel casual, though it was anything but. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" There it was. Not a question of confusion. A question of permission. Keanu looked at him for a moment, then gently reached for his boarding pass. "Yes," he said simply. Victor barely looked at it. Just a glance. Not enough to care. Not enough to confirm anything. Then he exhaled, almost amused. "This is first class," he said, as if stating something obvious that Keanu had somehow failed to understand. Keanu didn't react. He only placed the boarding pass back on his lap. "That's what it says." The calmness should have ended the conversation. But instead, it irritated Victor more. Because calm people do not defend themselves loudly, and in Victor's world, silence looked suspicious. He pressed the call button. A soft chime broke the tension. A flight attendant arrived within moments, Mara, professional, composed, trained to handle everything from spilled drinks to emotional passengers who believed urgency made them correct. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked politely. Victor did not look at her first. He looked at Keanu. I need this checked, he said. Mara followed his gaze. Of course. Is there a problem with the seat? Yes, Victor said immediately. There appears to be a mistake. Keanu calmly handed over his boarding pass again before anyone asked. Mara reviewed it carefully. Then checked the seat number. Then checked again. Her expression stayed professional, but something subtle changed in her eyes. There is no mistake, she said gently. This is the correct seat. Victor frowned instantly. Check again. Mara did. Sir, she repeated, more firmly now, the boarding pass matches this seat. That should have ended it. But it didn't. Because Victor was no longer trying to confirm facts. He was trying to correct reality. That doesn't make sense, he muttered. Then louder. I paid a lot of money for this seat. Mara nodded carefully. Yes, sir. I paid for comfort. Yes, sir. And I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him. The words landed differently now. Not private anymore. Not contained. The cabin began to change. A few heads turned. A magazine stopped mid-page. A glass paused halfway to a mouth. Keanu remained still. Not reacting. Not defending. Not shrinking. Just present. And that calmness made Victor's frustration louder. Mara tried again, carefully. Sir, is there something specific? Look at him, Victor interrupted sharply. The air tightened. That sentence didn't need explanation. It was already an accusation without evidence. Keanu lowered his gaze slightly, not in shame, but in patience. As if giving space for something ugly to pass through without absorbing it. Mara looked between them. Sir, she said carefully, all passengers in this cabin have been properly checked before boarding. Victor leaned forward. I don't know who approved this, but I am not sitting next to him. The cabin had stopped pretending not to listen, now it was fully listening. And somewhere between the quiet luxury of first class and the polished surface of its comfort, something uncomfortable had begun to surface. Not turbulence. Something worse. Human judgment. And it had only just begun. The cabin had not been designed for conflict. Everything about it suggested the opposite. Soft lighting, wide leather seats, the quiet rhythm of boarding, the careful movement of flight attendants, all of it existed to make people believe they were above tension, above discomfort, above ordinary problems. But conflict doesn't care about design. It only needs people. Mara stood between the two passengers now, her professional calm beginning to stretch under pressure. She had dealt with complaints before, about seating, about meals, about delays, but something about this felt different. Not because of the issue itself, but because of the way it was being framed. Not as a mistake. As a person. I understand your concern, sir, Mara said carefully, keeping her voice steady, but this seat assignment has been confirmed. Victor exhaled sharply, as if the words were refusing to enter his understanding. That's impossible, he said again, but this time there was less certainty behind it. More irritation. More disbelief that the world was not adjusting itself to his expectation. Keanu remained quiet. He did not interrupt. He did not defend. He simply sat there, hands relaxed, posture calm, as if this situation belonged to someone else entirely. That silence was beginning to feel heavier than Victor's voice. Because silence does not argue back. It only reflects. Mara glanced at Keanu briefly, then back at Victor. Sir, she said gently, if there is a personal concern, we can always try to assist, but we cannot remove a passenger without cause. Victor's eyes narrowed instantly. I have a concern, he said firmly. I don't feel comfortable. There it was again. Not safety. Not procedure. Not fact. just feeling. And feeling, in his mind, was enough. The cabin behind them had grown quieter than before. People were no longer pretending not to listen. A man across the aisle lowered his tablet. A woman near the window paused mid-scroll on her phone. Even the soft sound of boarding bags being placed overhead seemed to slow. Keanu finally turned his head slightly. Not toward Victor with anger. Not toward Mara with complaint. Just a quiet, measured glance, like someone observing a situation he had already understood from the beginning. "It's all right," Keanu said softly. Just that. 2 words. No defense. No resistance. No escalation. But those 2 words did something strange. They made Victor feel louder than he already was. "I didn't ask him," Victor snapped immediately. "I'm talking to the crew." The air tightened again. Mara's expression changed slightly now. Still controlled, but firmer. "Sir, please lower your voice." Victor gave a short, frustrated laugh. "Lower my voice? I'm the one being ignored here." That sentence shifted everything. Because now it wasn't about seating. It was about attention. About being heard. About being validated. Keanu stayed still, but something subtle changed in his expression, not anger, not offense, but a quiet disappointment, like someone recognizing a pattern they had seen too many times before. Mara pressed the communication button on her earpiece briefly, then released it. A signal. Backup was needed, and Victor noticed. "What is that?" he asked sharply. "Are you calling someone because I'm speaking?" "No, sir," Mara said calmly. "I'm following procedure." Victor leaned back slightly, then pointed toward Keanu without even looking fully at him. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I don't know who this man is, but I am not sitting beside him for a 6-hour flight." That line finally pulled more attention from the cabin. Because now it was no longer private discomfort. It was public rejection. Daniel, another flight attendant, stepped into the aisle from the front galley. Older, composed, the kind of presence that didn't rush anything. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked calmly. Victor didn't hesitate. "I want him moved." Daniel looked at Keanu. Then back at Victor. "May I ask why?" Victor scoffed. "Why does everyone keep asking that like it's complicated?" "I don't want him here." Daniel didn't react emotionally. Instead, he asked the simplest question possible. "Has he done something to you?" Victor hesitated for the first time, a fraction of silence. "No," he admitted. "But he doesn't belong here." That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else so far. Because now it wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about belonging. Keanu lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in restraint. As if absorbing the impact of something that didn't need to be returned. Daniel's tone changed slightly. "Sir," he said firmly, "this passenger has a valid first-class seat." Victor leaned forward again. "Then refund me," he said immediately. That was the moment the cabin fully understood the direction this was going. Because it was no longer logical. It was emotional escalation disguised as entitlement. Keanu finally spoke again, softly. "I can wait if it helps," he said. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was an attempt to reduce pressure in a space that was already overheating. But instead of calming the situation, it revealed something deeper. Victor smirked slightly. "Oh, now he's being reasonable," he muttered. That tone. That interpretation. That framing, it twisted the meaning of kindness into surrender. Mara looked uncomfortable now. Daniel stepped slightly closer. "Sir," he said more firmly, "you need to sit down." Victor's expression hardened instantly. "I am sitting," he said. "He's the issue." Keanu didn't react. But the woman across the aisle finally looked directly at Victor, her expression shifting from discomfort to quiet disapproval. Another passenger lowered his head, shaking it slightly. The cabin was no longer neutral. It was beginning to choose sides, not loudly, but visibly. Victor noticed that too. And instead of stepping back, he leaned into it. "I paid for this experience," he said louder now. "Not this." His hand gestured vaguely toward Keanu, as if presence itself was the problem. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That passenger is not interfering with your seat, your space, or your safety," he said. Victor's voice sharpened. "His presence is enough." And that was the sentence that changed the air completely. Because now it was no longer about action. It was about existence. Keanu finally looked toward him fully. Not angry. Not defensive. Just present. And that made Victor pause, just for a second, because something in that look didn't match what he expected. It wasn't weakness. It was restraint. The kind that doesn't escalate because it doesn't need to. Mara glanced toward the front again. Time was slipping. Boarding was slowing. The cabin door was still open. And somewhere in the background, the aircraft was still waiting to become a flight. But inside, something else had taken priority. Human judgment. And it was getting louder. The tension inside the first-class cabin did not fade after the initial exchange. If anything, it grew heavier, like a storm that had already arrived but was still deciding how violently it would fall. The air felt tighter now, not because of the aircraft, but because of the silence that had taken over every seat. Passengers no longer pretended to be busy. No one looked at their phones. No one adjusted their seats. Every movement had slowed, as if even the smallest sound might trigger something worse. Victor Harlan still sat in his seat, but it no longer looked like comfort. It looked like containment. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, and his eyes kept flicking toward the crew members as if he expected them to finally correct what he believed was an obvious mistake. His earlier confidence had not disappeared, but it had shifted. It was no longer loud. It was defensive, sharpened by the growing realization that the room was not responding the way he expected. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained still. There was nothing dramatic about his stillness. No performance of patience, no visible attempt to prove anything. He simply existed in his seat the way someone might sit in a quiet room at the end of a long day. His hands rested lightly, his expression calm, his eyes occasionally turning toward the window where the runway stretched under a pale sky. He did not engage, because there was nothing to engage with. And yet, paradoxically, his silence was becoming the loudest presence in the cabin. Mara, the flight attendant, stood near the aisle with a controlled but strained expression. She had been trained for difficult passengers, but situations like this were not just about procedure. They were about perception, timing, and the fragile balance of authority in a confined space. She could feel that balance slipping. Every second that passed without resolution made the cabin more unstable. Daniel, another crew member, leaned slightly toward her. "We need to escalate," he said quietly, just enough for her to hear. Mara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes moved briefly toward Victor, then toward Keanu, then toward the passengers watching everything unfold like a silent courtroom. She understood what escalate meant. It meant bringing in higher authority. It meant shifting this from a crew-managed disagreement to a formal intervention. It also meant that whatever happened next would set the tone for the rest of the flight. Finally, she nodded once. "I'll call the purser," she said. Victor heard the word immediately. His head lifted. "The purser," he repeated, as if confirming something he already wanted. "Good. Finally." There was a slight edge of satisfaction in his voice now. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossing loosely, as if the arrival of a higher authority would validate everything he had said so far. In his mind, escalation did not mean uncertainty. It meant reinforcement. Keanu did not react. Not even a glance. That lack of reaction disturbed Victor more than any argument could have. Mara stepped away toward the front galley where a communication panel was mounted discreetly behind a partition. She pressed a button, spoke briefly in a low, controlled voice, and then waited. Her expression remained professional, but the tension in her shoulders had changed. This was no longer routine. Inside the cabin, the silence deepened again. Even the faint hum of the aircraft seemed distant now, like it belonged to another world. Outside the windows, ground crew continued their movements, unaware of the quiet conflict unfolding just meters away. A fuel truck rolled slowly beneath the wing. A baggage cart turned sharply near a service lane. Everything outside functioned normally. Inside, time felt suspended. Victor glanced around the cabin again, this time searching for something that would support him. A nod. A whisper. A sign of agreement. But what he saw instead were faces that no longer mirrored his confidence. Some passengers looked uncomfortable. Others looked distant. A few looked directly at him, not with hostility, but with a quiet disapproval that needed no words. That unsettled him. No one responded. And that silence answered him more honestly than words ever could. Keanu finally adjusted his posture slightly, not out of discomfort, but simply to relax his shoulders. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it drew attention anyway. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the only movement that felt natural in a space full of tension. Mara returned from the front. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically, but enough for Daniel to notice immediately. "It's been escalated," she said quietly. Victor nodded quickly. Good, but Mara didn't look at him when she said it. Her eyes moved instead toward the front of the aircraft. "The purser is coming." That sentence changed the atmosphere again. Not because of fear, but because of anticipation. Passengers shifted slightly in their seats. The energy tightened. People who had been whispering fell silent again. The sense of waiting returned, but now it was sharper, more focused. Victor straightened his shirt collar. "This should have been handled already," he said under his breath, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Keanu remained unchanged, and that, more than anything, made the situation feel uneven. One man preparing for confrontation. The other refusing to acknowledge it existed. Footsteps approached from the front of the cabin. Measured. Controlled. Not rushed. The kind of footsteps that carried authority without announcing it. A figure appeared at the front entrance of first class. The purser. He paused for half a second, just long enough to take in everything without reacting. His eyes moved across the cabin in a single slow sweep. The stopped service. The watching passengers. The strained posture of the crew, the two men at the center of it. Not at Keanu first. He looked at the space itself. At the tension sitting between them. At the crew members positioned carefully in the aisle. At the passengers who had stopped pretending they weren't watching. Only after taking all of it in did he finally speak. "I understand there is a seating concern," he said calmly. His voice was even, controlled, without urgency. That calmness had a strange effect. It made the situation feel even more serious, because nothing about him suggested confusion or panic. Only evaluation. Victor responded instantly. "Yes," he said, leaning forward slightly. "There is. I've already explained it. I don't want to sit next to him." He gestured toward Keanu without looking at him directly, as if acknowledging him too directly would somehow validate his presence in a way Victor refused to allow. The purser nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting its conclusion. "And the reason?" he asked. Victor hesitated for half a second, just enough for the first crack in certainty to appear. Then he leaned into his explanation. "It's not about safety," he said quickly. "It's about comfort. I paid for first class. I expect a certain standard. I don't feel comfortable sitting beside someone who clearly doesn't belong here. The words hung in the air. Doesn't belong here. They were simple words, but in the enclosed cabin, they landed heavier than anything else said so far. A faint shift moved through the passengers. Someone lowered their gaze. Another looked out the window. A quiet discomfort spread, subtle but visible. The purser did not react immediately. Instead, he turned his attention slightly toward Mara. Has the passenger in question violated any rules? He asked. Mara responded carefully. No, sir. He has been seated properly since boarding. No disturbances. The purser nodded again. Then his gaze moved toward Daniel. Any safety concerns? No, Daniel replied without hesitation. None. Now the purser turned fully toward Victor. And for the first time, the silence felt directed. Mr. Harlan, he said calmly, at this point, your concern is not based on conduct or safety. Victor's expression tightened immediately. That's not true, he said quickly. I'm telling you I'm uncomfortable. That should matter. It does matter, the purser replied evenly. But discomfort alone does not justify removing a seated passenger who has done nothing wrong. The word wrong lingered for a moment longer than the rest of the sentence. Keanu shifted his gaze slightly toward the window again, as if giving the moment space to unfold without him in the center of it. Victor leaned back slightly, frustration rising. So what are you saying, he asked, that I just have to sit here and accept this? The purser's tone remained steady. I am saying, he replied, that all passengers on this aircraft have equal rights to their assigned seats. A soft murmur moved through the cabin at that line, quickly contained but impossible to fully erase. Victor's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous, he said again, but this time there was less confidence in it. More pressure. More urgency. You're choosing him over a paying customer. The purser didn't react to the accusation. Then he stepped forward. Each step deliberate. Each movement calm. Victor watched him approach like someone expecting validation. Keanu looked at him like someone waiting for nothing at all. And in that contrast, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, because whatever decision came next would not just settle a seat. It would decide what kind of behavior this flight would allow. And who, if anyone, would be asked to leave it behind. The purser walked deeper into the first-class cabin with steady, unhurried steps, but the effect of his presence was immediate. It wasn't authority announced through words. It was authority felt through silence. Conversations that had been forming in whispers died out completely. Even the faint shifting of passengers in their seats seemed to slow, as if the cabin itself understood that something decisive was about to happen. Victor Harlan watched him approach with a tense kind of expectation. His posture subtly adjusted, shoulders lifting slightly, as though preparing to present his case in full confidence to a higher judge. In his mind, this was the moment where order would be restored, where someone with real authority would finally recognize what he believed was obvious from the beginning. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained unchanged. Calm. Still. Present, but not performing presence. He did not lean forward. He did not lean back. He simply existed in his seat as though the conflict belonged to another world entirely. That contrast between the two men had now become impossible to ignore for anyone watching. The purser stopped beside the row. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked. Not at Victor first. Instead, he simply asked, "What exactly are you seeing that makes you believe he does not belong here?" That question changed the direction of the entire exchange. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't argumentative. It was observational. Victor hesitated. For the first time, he actually looked at Keanu properly. Not the clothes. Not the appearance he had judged earlier. But the person sitting there. Calm. Composed. Unbothered. And something in Victor's expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. A flicker of doubt, not fully formed recognition yet, but the beginning of something unstable. Still, pride pushed back immediately. "I don't need to explain basic expectations of appearance," he said sharply. A few passengers stiffened at that line. The purser nodded slowly, as if absorbing the final confirmation he needed. "I understand your position," he said. Then he turned slightly. Not to Victor. Not to Mara. To Keanu. The entire cabin seemed to tighten again. Because up until now, Keanu had been observed, judged, and spoken about, but not directly engaged by authority in a way that felt final. "Sir," the purser said gently, "are you comfortable continuing in your assigned seat?" The cabin went completely still. Even Victor paused. Keanu looked at the purser for the first time since he arrived. There was no urgency in his expression. No irritation. No attempt to gain advantage from the situation. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm fine here." Just those words. Nothing more. No complaint. No accusation. No escalation. And somehow, that made everything heavier again, because it removed any remaining illusion that this was a mutual conflict. This was one person being disturbed. And another refusing to disturb anyone back. The purser held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Understood," he said quietly. Victor immediately reacted. "So that's it?" he asked. "He just stays there and I'm supposed to be fine with it?" The purser turned back to him. "Yes," he said. "Because he is seated correctly, and there is no valid reason for a change." The words were final, but not loud. And that was what made them land so hard. Victor stared at him, disbelief rising again, but now it was thinner. Less stable. "This is going to be reported," he said. "That is your right," the purser replied. Another silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind from earlier. A different kind. A concluding silence. Because something in the structure of the situation had shifted. The authority had spoken, not in favor of emotion. Not in favor of pressure. But in favor of procedure. And for the first time since the conflict began, the cabin began to understand that the outcome was not going to change just because one person demanded it loudly enough. Keanu remained still. Victor remained seated, but no longer fully confident. And the purser stood between them like a line that could not be crossed anymore without consequences. The cabin did not relax. But it stopped escalating. And in that stillness, everyone understood something unspoken. The moment was no longer about whether Keanu would be moved. It was about what Victor would choose to do next. The silence that followed the purser's decision was different from the earlier silences in the cabin. Before, silence had been tension, something waiting to explode. Now, it felt like structure. Like something had finally been placed in the right order, even if not everyone agreed with it. Victor Harlan sat rigidly in his seat, his arms crossed tighter than before, his jaw working silently as if he was chewing through thoughts he could not release out loud anymore. The confidence he had carried at the beginning of the situation was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer bold. It was compressed. Pressurized. Contained. He looked around the cabin again, almost instinctively searching for support, but what he found unsettled him more than before. The passengers were no longer just observers. Some were watching him directly now, not aggressively, not openly hostile, but with a quiet clarity that made him aware he was no longer controlling the room. That realization made his fingers tighten against the armrest. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained exactly as he had been from the beginning. Still. Calm. Unreactive. It wasn't indifference. It was something more grounded than that. A refusal to turn discomfort into performance. His gaze drifted briefly toward the window again, where the light outside had begun to soften slightly as the afternoon shifted. The runway was still active, but everything out there felt distant, like another timeline that had nothing to do with what was happening inside the aircraft. The purser stood between them, not moving, allowing the weight of his earlier statement to settle fully. Mara stood slightly behind him now, hands clasped, her expression composed but clearly affected by how far the situation had escalated. Daniel remained near the aisle, his posture steady, eyes scanning both passengers and crew readiness. Every member of the crew now understood the situation was no longer about simple seating logistics. It had become something about conduct, perception, and control. Victor broke the silence first. "This is going to look bad for your airline," he said, voice lower than before but still sharp. The purser didn't react emotionally. "Mr. Harlan," he said calmly, "we are not making decisions based on how something looks. We are making decisions based on policy and passenger rights." Victor scoffed, but it lacked its earlier force. "Passenger rights," he repeated. "So my right to be comfortable doesn't matter?" The purser held his gaze. "Your comfort matters," he said. "It does not override another passenger's right to remain in a seat they have been assigned and have done nothing to forfeit." The phrasing was precise. Controlled. Final in its structure. Victor leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, frustration building again, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion. Because the logic was no longer bending toward him. And that was unfamiliar. He glanced at Keanu again, and this time his eyes lingered a fraction longer than before. Something about the calmness there was starting to feel less like indifference and more like something he couldn't quite categorize. A few passengers shifted subtly, sensing the change. Not in the argument, but in Victor himself. The certainty he had walked in with was thinning. The purser continued. "At this point," he said, "you have two options. You may remain seated and allow the flight to proceed, or you may choose to deboard before departure." The words were not loud. But they were absolute. A small sound moved through the cabin, barely audible, but collective. The kind of reaction people make when they realize the situation has reached a point of consequence. Victor blinked once. Then again. "Deboard," he repeated slowly. "Yes," the purser said, "if you cannot comply with crew instructions regarding respectful conduct, we will have to consider whether you can continue on this flight." For the first time, Victor didn't respond immediately. He looked around again. This time not searching for allies, but measuring reality. The passengers weren't on his side. The crew wasn't bending. The man he had been targeting had not reacted with anger, fear, or resistance. He had simply remained present, as if none of this had shaken his position in the world. That quiet stability was becoming harder for Victor to ignore. Keanu finally shifted slightly in his seat, not to engage, not to react, but simply to rest his hands differently. A small, natural movement, and yet it pulled attention anyway, because everything about him now carried weight in contrast to the chaos around him. Victor's voice dropped slightly. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, but it sounded less like a statement now and more like an attempt to hold something together. The purser answered evenly. "You expressed discomfort. That is valid. But you escalated it into repeated refusal, public disruption, and personal remarks about another passenger's belonging in this cabin." Victor's expression tightened again. "I was being honest," he said. The purser nodded once. "And we are being clear with you," he replied. "Honesty does not include demeaning another person based on appearance or assumption." That sentence landed differently. Not like a correction. Like a mirror. Victor looked down for a brief moment, then back up again, but something had shifted in his posture. The certainty wasn't fully gone, but it was no longer leading him. Mara glanced toward Daniel. Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The situation was stabilizing, but not through agreement. Through containment. The purser turned slightly toward Keanu again. "Mr. Reeves, he said quietly, we apologize for the disturbance. We appreciate your patience. This time, the name didn't just pass through the crew. It reached passengers more clearly. A ripple of recognition moved through the cabin. Not loud. Not chaotic. But undeniable. A woman too rose back, covered her mouth slightly as she whispered to the person beside her. A man across the aisle leaned forward, eyes narrowing as memory finally connected the name with the face. Keanu Reeves. The recognition didn't change who he was. But it changed how people understood what had just happened. Victor noticed it too. Slowly. And the realization didn't arrive as a single moment. It arrived in pieces, the familiarity of the face. The calm presence. The growing reactions around him. And suddenly, what he had treated as someone who doesn't belong was becoming something else entirely. His throat tightened slightly, though he tried to mask it. Keanu gave a small nod to the purser. It's fine, he said quietly. Just that. No complaint. No emphasis. No attempt to use recognition as leverage. And somehow, that made the atmosphere heavier again, not lighter. Because it highlighted the contrast in the simplest way possible. The purser turned back toward Victor. Mr. Harlan, he said again, steady but firm, I need your decision. The cabin went still. Not waiting for drama. Waiting for outcome. Victor looked at Keanu one more time. This time, really looked. And for the first time since boarding, his expression wasn't fully controlled anymore. Something underneath it had cracked slightly, not fully broken, but exposed. And in that exposure, the decision he had been fighting against was no longer just about pride. It was about whether he would continue pushing a moment that the entire cabin had already stopped supporting. The purser waited. The crew waited. The passengers waited. Even Keanu, in his quiet stillness, simply waited. And in that pressure of collective silence, Victor finally understood that the next words he spoke would not just decide a seat. They would decide whether he stayed in the air at all. The cabin did not feel like an airplane anymore. It felt like a suspended moment in time, as if the entire aircraft had paused between two decisions and was waiting for a human being to choose which direction reality would continue in. Victor Harlan sat frozen in that space, his hands no longer moving, his confidence no longer performing. The earlier version of him, the one who had spoken loudly, demanded control, and expected instant compliance, felt distant now, almost unrecognizable even to himself. What remained was something quieter, more uncertain, and visibly strained. Around him, the passengers no longer looked like passive observers. They had become witnesses. Not in an aggressive way, but in a way that made the atmosphere heavier. Every face in first class carried awareness now. Awareness of what had been said. Awareness of what had been allowed. And awareness of what was about to happen next. The purser remained still, his presence steady and unshaken. He was not rushing Victor. He was not filling the silence. He was allowing it to do its job. Beside him, Mara stood with controlled tension in her posture, and Daniel remained slightly behind, alert but calm. The crew was no longer reacting, they were holding the situation in place. Keanu Reeves, however, remained unchanged. That was what made everything feel even more uneven. No visible anger. No satisfaction. No performance of dignity. Just stillness. A quiet acceptance of the space he occupied, as if the world around him could shift however it wanted, and he would remain exactly where he was. Victor finally moved again, but slowly this time. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting near his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere between the floor and the seat in front of him. For the first time, he wasn't speaking to control the room. He was speaking to understand his position in it. "This is getting out of proportion," he said quietly. The purser didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang. Then, calmly, he said, it only feels that way when accountability is introduced. A few passengers shifted at that line. It wasn't aggressive, but it was precise. It reframed everything that had happened without raising its volume. Victor exhaled through his nose, frustration still there, but no longer fully supported by certainty. "I asked for a seat change," he said again, but now it sounded more like repetition than argument. "That's all I did." Mara spoke gently, but firmly. "You did more than request, sir," she said. "You repeatedly refused to accept the crew's response and made personal remarks about another passenger." Victor glanced at her quickly. "I didn't insult anyone," he replied, though even he seemed less convinced by his own wording now. Daniel stepped in slightly, his voice calm but direct. "You said he didn't belong here," he reminded him. That sentence landed harder this time than it had before. Because it wasn't new anymore. It had been recorded in the memory of the cabin. Victor didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered briefly toward Keanu again, and this time, something different happened in his expression. Recognition wasn't just forming anymore. It was sharpening. The face he had dismissed earlier was now connecting to something he couldn't fully place but strongly felt. The calm, the familiarity, the quiet authority without effort, it was beginning to align with fragments of memory. Films. Interviews. A public image he had seen countless times but never considered in this context. The realization wasn't complete yet. But it was coming. The purser noticed the shift in Victor's expression. He didn't interrupt it. He allowed it to form naturally. Instead, he said, "Mr. Harlan, I will ask you again. Do you wish to remain on this flight under the condition that all passengers are treated with respect?" Victor hesitated. Longer this time. The cabin felt it. Even the smallest delay in answer became significant now, because the moment was no longer about disagreement. It was about choice. Victor finally leaned back slightly, rubbing his thumb against his fingers as if trying to ground himself. "I just don't understand why this had to become so complicated," he said, quieter now. "It didn't need to be like this." The purser nodded once. "It didn't," he agreed. That simple agreement shifted something again, not in Victor's favor, but in truth's favor. It acknowledged that the situation could have been avoided entirely. Silence returned. But this time it wasn't empty. It was reflective. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were interpreting. Processing. Re-evaluating everything that had happened from the first moment Victor spoke. Keanu finally turned his head slightly, not toward Victor, but toward the aisle, just enough to adjust his view. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes now that wasn't visible earlier. Not anger. Not sadness. More like distance. The kind of distance that forms when a person has seen versions of this moment before, in different places, with different faces, but the same pattern underneath it. Mara noticed it. For a brief second, her expression softened, as if she understood something unspoken about him. Not just the passenger. The person. Victor followed Keanu's subtle movement again, and this time the recognition finally clicked fully into place. His eyes narrowed slightly. A pause. A flicker. And then the realization hit him in full. It wasn't immediate speech. It was hesitation. The kind that comes when a person suddenly realizes they are not standing in front of a stranger, but someone widely known, someone whose presence changes the meaning of everything said before. A small shift passed through Victor's posture. Less aggression. More uncertainty. The purser noticed it, but did not comment. Instead, he said, "Mr. Harlan, I need a clear answer now." That brought Victor back into the present. His throat moved slightly as he swallowed. He started, then paused. The cabin waited. Keanu didn't react. Mara didn't move. Daniel didn't speak. Even the passengers seemed to hold their breath without realizing it. Finally, Victor exhaled. "I will remain seated," he said, though the words came out more controlled than confident, "but I still think this was handled poorly." The purser nodded once. "Noted," he said calmly. Then, without turning it into a spectacle, he added, "Then we will proceed with departure." A quiet ripple moved through the cabin. The resolution wasn't dramatic. There was no applause. No confrontation. Just a release of pressure that had been building since the moment Victor first spoke. The purser signaled subtly to the crew. Mara immediately moved toward the front to coordinate boarding continuation. Daniel adjusted his position to ensure the aisle remained clear. The system of the cabin began to restart itself, slowly, carefully, as if recovering from a disruption it would remember. But even as movement returned, the emotional weight remained. Not because he had changed, but because their understanding of him had. The cabin slowly returned to motion, but it no longer felt like the same space that had existed before the confrontation. The shift was subtle, almost invisible on the surface, yet deeply present in the atmosphere. Passengers began adjusting their seats again, small conversations restarted in whispers, and the faint rustle of boarding activity resumed. But underneath it all, something had changed permanently. It was the memory of what had just happened. Mara moved down the aisle with controlled efficiency, signaling to the remaining passengers waiting to board. Her movements were professional, but her expression still carried the weight of what she had just been part of. Some experiences in service work passed quickly. Others stayed. This one would stay. Daniel stood near the front of the cabin, monitoring the flow as boarding continued. His posture had relaxed slightly, but his attention remained sharp. Crew members like him understood that even after resolution, emotional aftershocks could still ripple through a flight. The purser, Adrian Cole, remained near the row for a few seconds longer. Not to enforce anything now, but to ensure stability had truly returned. His eyes moved briefly across the cabin, checking for any remaining tension points. Only when he was satisfied did he begin to step back toward the front. Victor Harlan stayed seated. But stayed seated did not mean settled. His posture had changed again. The rigid defiance from earlier had softened into something less defined. He looked forward, then slightly downward, as if trying to process what had just unfolded without fully accepting it yet. For the first time, he wasn't reacting to others. He was reacting to himself. Keanu Reeves remained still beside him. There was no change in expression, no shift in demeanor. But now, the silence around him felt different, not because he demanded attention, but because attention had already found him, whether he invited it or not. A few rows back, subtle recognition was spreading more clearly now. Passengers who had not been sure before were now certain. Small, quiet reactions passed between them, brief glances, silent confirmations, the kind of awareness that spreads without needing explanation. One passenger leaned slightly toward another. "That's him," he whispered. The reply came in a hushed tone. "Yeah. I think it is." But even with recognition forming, no one disrupted the cabin further. The earlier confrontation had made everyone more aware of boundaries, of how quickly words could escalate in a confined space. Keanu did not acknowledge the whispers. He simply adjusted his posture slightly, resting back into the seat in a way that suggested he had already moved past the moment emotionally, even if the room around him had not. Victor noticed the change in atmosphere. Not fully at first. But gradually, he saw the way passengers were no longer looking at him with agreement, but with quiet observation. He saw how some attention had shifted away from judgment and toward recognition of the man beside him. And slowly, that realization began to settle into something uncomfortable. He finally turned his head slightly toward Keanu again. This time, he looked longer. Not with hostility. Not with confidence. But with recalculation. Pieces were aligning in his mind: familiarity, recognition, context. The face he had dismissed earlier was now clearly placing itself in memory. Films, public appearances. A presence that existed far beyond this cabin, far beyond this moment. And with that recognition came something unexpected. Discomfort. Because the story he had built in his mind about someone who doesn't belong no longer matched reality. The purser returned briefly to the front galley area, speaking quietly with another crew member. The boarding process continued steadily now, but more carefully, as if the crew itself had recalibrated after the incident. Mara passed by Keanu's row again while checking seat confirmations further down the cabin. For a brief second, her eyes met his. Not professionally. Not procedurally. Humanly, and Keanu gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging her effort, not the conflict. That simple gesture seemed to ease something in her expression, even if only slightly. "Thank you," she said softly as she moved past. Keanu did not respond verbally, but his expression carried understanding. Behind them, Victor shifted again in his seat. He was quieter now. Not silent, but subdued. The earlier need to dominate the situation had weakened, replaced by something more internal. His hands rested on his lap instead of gripping the armrest. His gaze stayed forward more often than before, avoiding direct engagement with the man beside him. But the mind does not quiet just because the voice does. And in Victor's mind, the realization was now fully formed. He knew who Keanu was. And that knowledge changed the weight of everything he had said. A flicker of embarrassment surfaced, quickly suppressed. Then frustration returned, but directed inward this time. Because the situation could no longer be rewritten, the purser's voice came over a subtle communication channel near the front, confirming that boarding was nearly complete. The cabin doors were still open, but the energy had shifted from conflict to transition. The flight was moving forward again. Not because the issue disappeared, but because it had been contained. Keanu looked out the window once more. The sky outside had shifted slightly in color, softer now, as the light continued to change. Ground vehicles moved in coordinated patterns below, indifferent to the human tension that had just unfolded above them. Inside, the cabin felt like it was slowly exhaling. Victor finally spoke again, but this time his voice was lower, less forceful. "I didn't know," he said quietly, though it wasn't clear if he was speaking to the crew or to himself. No one responded immediately. Because the statement did not require agreement. It required understanding. But understanding, in moments like this, does not arrive instantly. The purser reappeared briefly at the front, scanning the cabin once more. His gaze paused for a moment on Keanu, then on Victor, then moved on. The situation was no longer active. It had transitioned into aftermath. Still, the weight of it remained. Mara took her position again, preparing for final boarding checks. Daniel adjusted his stance near the aisle. And slowly, the aircraft began to return to what it was supposed to be. But no one inside would forget that something had happened here. Not just a disagreement. Not just a delay. But a moment where judgment had entered too quickly. And truth had arrived quietly afterward. And in the middle of it all, Keanu Reeves had remained exactly the same. The final passengers were settling into their seats now, but the cabin still hadn't fully recovered its original rhythm. There was movement again, yes, overhead bins closing, seatbelts fastening, soft instructions from the crew, but underneath it all, a quiet residue remained. The kind that lingers after something uncomfortable has been witnessed but not forgotten. Victor Harlan sat rigidly in his seat, staring forward. The fight inside him had changed shape again. It wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't outward. It had turned inward, looping through his thoughts in smaller, sharper fragments. The realization of who had been sitting beside him wasn't just knowledge, it was pressure. Pressure on his earlier certainty. Pressure on his judgment. Pressure on the way he had spoken. He didn't look at Keanu anymore. Not directly. Because looking would make it real in a way he wasn't ready to fully process. Keanu Reeves remained still, as he had throughout everything. But now, the calm around him felt different to those who understood the identity behind it. What had once been misread as out of place now carried a quiet contradiction the cabin could not ignore. The simplicity of his presence no longer matched the assumptions that had been made about him. That contradiction sat heavily in the air. Mara moved through the aisle once more, checking final seat adjustments, her movements precise but slightly slower now. The urgency from earlier had faded, replaced by a controlled routine, yet her eyes occasionally flicked toward the row where everything had started, as if her mind kept returning to it without permission. Daniel stood near the front, speaking quietly with another crew member. The boarding process was almost complete. The aircraft door was still open, but only for final confirmations. The purser, Adrian Cole, remained composed as he reviewed the final checklist on his tablet. His expression was unchanged from earlier, calm, structured, professional, but there was a subtle awareness in him now, a sense that this flight would not just be another routine departure in memory. It would be one of those moments crews remember without needing to speak about it. Victor finally shifted slightly in his seat. Not dramatically. Just enough to break the stiffness. He exhaled once through his nose, then glanced toward the aisle, not at Keanu, but at the space between them. The emptiness of that glance felt symbolic now. Earlier, he had tried to fill that space with control. Now it felt like something he could no longer influence. A young passenger a few rows back leaned toward his companion again, whispering more confidently this time. "It really is him," he said. The reply came quietly. "Yeah. I saw it in his face when they said the name." The recognition had fully spread now, but it was no longer disruptive. It was reflective. People weren't reacting loudly. They were absorbing the contrast between what had been assumed and what had been revealed. Keanu remained composed, looking out the window again. His posture suggested he had already left the emotional space of the conflict, even if the cabin had not. But then something subtle changed. Victor finally spoke again. Not loudly. Not defensively. Just quietly. "I didn't recognize you," he said. The words were not directed at the cabin, they were directed at Keanu. Keanu didn't turn immediately. He stayed facing the window for a moment longer, as if giving the statement space to exist without pressure. Then, slowly, he turned his head slightly toward Victor. There was no tension in his expression. No judgment. Just acknowledgement. "It's fine," he said simply. 2 words. No expansion. No reinforcement. Just release. But that simplicity made the moment heavier, not lighter. Because it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't excuse it. It simply refused to escalate it further. Victor nodded once, but it was small, uncertain. For the first time, his voice carried something softer beneath it. "I shouldn't have spoken like that," he said. The cabin didn't react outwardly, but several passengers shifted slightly. Not because they were surprised, but because they were listening more closely now than before. Keanu finally turned fully toward him. Not with superiority. Not with distance. Just presence. "I've heard worse," he said quietly. That single line changed the emotional temperature again, not because it excused anything, but because it removed the need for further collapse or apology in dramatic form. It grounded the moment in something simpler, less performative. Victor looked down for a moment, his fingers pressing lightly against each other. The purser, who had been listening from the front without interrupting, stepped closer again, not to intervene, but to confirm stability. "Cabin is ready for departure," he announced calmly. The aircraft door began to prepare for closure. A final wave of movement passed through the cabin as passengers adjusted themselves, seatbelts clicked into place, and overhead compartments were checked one last time. But emotionally, something had settled. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough for the flight to continue. Mara stopped briefly near Keanu's row, her voice lower now, almost personal. "Thank you for your patience," she said again, quieter than before. Keanu gave a small nod. "No problem," he replied. But Mara didn't move immediately. Her expression carried something unspoken, an awareness of how quickly dignity can be tested in confined spaces, and how differently people respond when the pressure is directed at them. Then she moved on. Victor remained still for a moment longer, then leaned back fully into his seat. The tension in his shoulders hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened into exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion more than physical. The kind that follows when a person realizes they no longer control the narrative they thought they were shaping. He glanced once more toward Keanu, but this time, there was no challenge in it. Only recognition. Not just of identity, but of consequence. The purser returned to the front, signaling final readiness. The cabin door began to close. A soft mechanical sound echoed through the aircraft. And with it, the final boundary between ground and flight was sealed. The engines began their deeper hum, steady and powerful, as the plane prepared to move. Inside, no one spoke. Not because they were told to, but because the moment no longer required words. And in that quiet, the cabin carried something new into its next phase of flight. Not tension. Not conflict. But memory. The cabin no longer felt like an aircraft preparing for departure. It felt like a paused moment inside a larger story, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to decide what kind of ending this would have. Adrian Cole stood beside the row in first class, his hand still resting lightly on the edge of the seat in front of Victor Harlan. The purser's expression had not changed, but something inside the cabin had shifted in a way no announcement could fix. The air felt heavier now, not with anger alone, but with awareness. People were beginning to understand that this was no ordinary seating dispute. Victor, however, still hadn't fully accepted that reality. He sat rigidly in his seat, arms crossed, jaw tight, as if refusing to let the situation outgrow his control. But for the first time, there was something missing in him. Confidence. It had started to fracture the moment Adrian said the name, Mr. Reeves. Keanu remained exactly as he had been since the beginning. Calm. Still. Patient in a way that felt almost unreal in contrast to everything unfolding around him. He didn't look at Victor. He didn't look at the crew. His gaze stayed near the window, where the runway stretched under the fading light, as if he had already stepped away from the noise inside the cabin long before anyone else could. Adrian finally broke the silence, his voice measured and controlled. "Mr. Harlan," he said quietly, "I need to address the situation fully, so there is no misunderstanding." Victor let out a short breath through his nose, almost dismissive. "There shouldn't be any misunderstanding," he replied. "I've made it very clear what the issue is." Adrian didn't react to the tone. Instead, he lifted the tablet slightly, glancing at the information again, confirming what he already suspected. Then he looked toward Mara. A small nod passed between them. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. But it carried weight. That small exchange was enough for Victor to notice. "What is that?" Victor asked, his voice sharpening slightly. "What are you checking?" Adrian turned back to him. "I am confirming passenger details." Victor leaned forward a little, trying to regain control through pressure. "You already checked that. He has a seat." "Fine. Then move him somewhere else. End this." For a brief moment, Adrian said nothing. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he was choosing the right moment to deliver it. Mara shifted slightly in the aisle. Daniel stood still behind Adrian, arms folded now, his posture signaling something had changed in the internal decision-making. Adrian finally spoke. "Mr. Harlan, the passenger in seat 2B is traveling under a protected service arrangement." The sentence landed quietly, but it changed the entire temperature of the row. Victor frowned. "What does that even mean?" Adrian continued, steady and precise. It means his travel details are handled with discretion. It means he is not to be disturbed or publicly identified unless he chooses otherwise. And it means decisions about seating are not made based on passenger preference or discomfort. A ripple moved through the nearby seats. People who had been whispering stopped completely. Even those who didn't fully understand the terminology understood the seriousness in the purser's voice. Victor, however, was still trying to process it through the lens he had built from the beginning of this encounter. "So what are you saying?" he asked slowly. "He gets special treatment. And I'm supposed to just accept that?" Adrian met his eyes directly. "I am saying," he replied, "that no passenger has the authority to demand another passenger be removed based on appearance, assumption, or personal discomfort." A silence followed that sentence. Not dramatic. Not forced. Just absolute. Victor's jaw tightened. For the first time, he didn't respond immediately. But the damage to his ego had already begun to show. From the aisle behind, a soft murmur passed through the cabin again. The name had already spread. Not loudly. Not officially. But enough. Keanu Reeves. It was no longer a guess. It was recognition forming in pieces. A man 2 rows back leaned slightly toward his wife. "I think it really is him." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, the woman who had earlier spoken in Keanu's defense now stared openly, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. The realization was settling in not like a shock, but like something she couldn't unsee once it appeared. Victor heard the whispers. He turned his head slightly, scanning faces, trying to understand what had changed in the room. Why the energy had shifted. Why the judgment that once seemed aligned with him was now slipping away. "What is everyone talking about?" he demanded. "What's his name supposed to change?" No one answered him directly. That silence was louder than anything else in the cabin. Adrian stepped half a pace closer now, his voice lower, but sharper in control. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "I need you to understand something very clearly." Victor looked at him, still resisting. Adrian continued. "You are sitting next to a globally recognized public figure. And more importantly, you are sitting next to a passenger who has done absolutely nothing to justify the treatment he has received from you." The words hit differently this time. Not as explanation, but as final clarification. Victor blinked once. The resistance in his face didn't vanish, but it cracked. Just slightly. Enough for uncertainty to slip in. He looked toward Keanu again. Really looked this time. Not the clothes. Not the assumption. Not the story he had created in his head. The face. And slowly, painfully, recognition began to form where judgment had been. It wasn't instant. It wasn't dramatic. It came in fragments. A memory of interviews. A familiar calm voice in films. A presence on screen that millions knew instantly but rarely connected to reality sitting quietly beside them in an airplane seat. Keanu Reeves. The realization didn't make Victor stand up. It made him still. For the first time since the conflict began, he had nothing immediate to say. Adrian didn't rush him. He didn't press further. He simply let the truth settle in the space between them. Mara exhaled slowly, almost silently. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, watching Victor now not as an aggressor, but as someone who had just lost control of his own narrative. Keanu finally turned his head again. Not toward Victor with anger. Not toward the crew with complaint. But just slightly, enough to acknowledge the shift in the room. His expression hadn't changed. But now, people were finally seeing it differently. Calm was no longer mistaken for insignificance. Silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. Victor swallowed. For the first time, his voice came out lower than before. "You could have said something," he muttered, almost to himself. Keanu looked at him for a brief moment. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "I didn't need to." That was all he said. And somehow, it was enough. The cabin didn't move. No one spoke. Even Victor didn't respond immediately, because in that moment, the entire meaning of the situation had shifted, not because of authority, not because of recognition, but because of how little it had taken for one man to remain calm while another lost control of himself completely. The silence inside the first-class cabin did not feel empty anymore. It felt like something had settled into place, something irreversible. Even the smallest sounds, the faint rustle of clothing, the distant hum of the aircraft systems, seemed amplified against the weight of what had just been acknowledged. Victor Harlan remained seated, but his posture had changed. The rigid certainty that had carried him through the earlier confrontation was gone, replaced by something far less comfortable. Uncertainty. He wasn't looking at Keanu anymore. He wasn't looking at the crew either. His gaze had dropped slightly, as if the floor of the cabin had suddenly become easier to face than the people around him. The name still lingered in the air. Keanu Reeves. Now it wasn't just a rumor passed through whispers. It was confirmed reality. And that reality had quietly rewritten every assumption Victor had made from the moment Keanu had stepped into the cabin. Adrian Cole, the purser, stood steady beside the row. His authority hadn't increased in volume, but it had deepened in presence. He wasn't reacting to the recognition spreading through the cabin. He was focused on what came next. Because recognition didn't solve behavior. It only exposed it. Mara stood a step behind him, still holding the boarding rhythm of the aircraft in her mind, even though the boarding process had been completely disrupted. Her training told her to keep things moving. Her instincts told her something larger was unfolding in front of her. Daniel remained at the aisle, scanning both the cabin and Victor, ready in case the situation shifted again. But it didn't shift outwardly. It shifted inwardly. Victor finally spoke again, but his voice lacked its earlier edge. "So, what now?" he asked quietly. The question wasn't a challenge this time, it sounded almost lost. Adrian turned slightly toward him. "Now," he said calmly, "we ensure the flight continues without further disruption." Victor gave a short, humorless breath. "That's easy for you to say now," he muttered. Adrian didn't respond to that. Instead, he turned slightly toward Keanu Reeves. "Mr. Reeves," he said respectfully, "you are not required to move. Your seat is confirmed, and your comfort on this flight is our priority." Keanu nodded once. No drama. No emphasis. Just acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said simply. That simplicity carried more weight than any argument that had come before it. Victor shifted again in his seat. Something inside him was trying to reconcile two versions of reality. The one he had created in his head, and the one now standing in front of him. A famous name did not erase what had already been said. It only made it harder to deny. The woman across the aisle spoke softly, almost cautiously. "You shouldn't have spoken to him like that," she said. Victor turned toward her immediately, but his reaction lacked conviction. "I didn't know," he said. No one responded. Because that wasn't the issue anymore. Adrian finally took a small step forward, addressing the row as a whole, but clearly directing his words toward Victor. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "this situation is now closed from an operational standpoint. The passenger in 2B will remain in his assigned seat. The aircraft will prepare for departure shortly." Victor looked up at him. "And me?" he asked. Adrian didn't hesitate. "You may remain on this flight provided you follow crew instructions and maintain respectful conduct for the duration of the journey." That sentence landed heavily, not because it was aggressive, but because it was final. Victor had not been removed. But he had also not been validated. He sat in a space that now required him to adjust, not everyone else. For the first time since boarding, Victor leaned back fully into his seat. Not in confidence, but in resignation. Keanu remained still beside him, as if nothing around him had changed his internal state. That calmness was no longer invisible to the cabin. It had become the reference point against which everything else felt unstable. Adrian looked down the aisle. "Boarding will resume," he said to Mara. Mara nodded immediately, stepping toward the entrance to signal ground staff. The movement of passengers began again slowly, carefully, as if the cabin itself had learned caution. But now something had changed in how people looked as they walked past first class. They weren't just boarding an aircraft anymore. They were passing through a story. A man with a carry-on paused briefly when he saw Keanu. His expression shifted instantly from curiosity to recognition. He said nothing, but his eyes widened slightly before he continued forward. A woman followed behind him, glancing once at Victor, then at Keanu. Her expression tightened, not with confusion anymore, but understanding. Victor noticed those looks. And they hurt more than the confrontation itself. Because they were not directed at him as a person who made a mistake. They were directed at him as someone who had revealed something about himself. Adrian remained near the aisle, ensuring control of the situation didn't slip again. His voice lowered slightly as he spoke to Mara. "Monitor boarding closely. We're stable now, but we don't want another escalation." Mara nodded. But her eyes briefly moved toward Keanu Reeves again. There was something difficult about what she felt. Not admiration in the simple sense, but discomfort at how easily dignity had been tested in front of someone who had not asked for attention. Keanu adjusted his position slightly in the seat. Not because he was disturbed, but because the aircraft was preparing for movement again. His hand rested loosely on the armrest, his posture unchanged. Calm. Grounded. Detached from the noise that had briefly tried to define him. Victor glanced sideways again. This time, he spoke more quietly. "I didn't recognize you," he said. Keanu turned his head slightly toward him. "I know," he replied. No accusation. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. That response made Victor exhale slowly, as if something inside him had finally stopped resisting reality. "I shouldn't have," Victor began, then stopped. The words didn't complete themselves. Not yet. Keanu didn't push him to finish them. He simply waited. But not in expectation. In peace. Adrian, sensing the shift, stepped back slightly to allow the cabin to return to its normal rhythm. His role was no longer about intervention. It was about ensuring stability. The boarding doors finally began to close in the background. A soft announcement echoed through the aircraft. "Cabin crew, please prepare for departure." The words felt ordinary again. But nothing inside the cabin was ordinary anymore. Victor stared forward, no longer attempting to control the situation. The urgency had drained from him, replaced by something quieter. Reflection, though incomplete. Keanu turned his gaze back toward the window. Outside, the runway lights were beginning to glow as evening approached. Inside, the cabin slowly returned to motion. But the memory of what had happened did not fade with it. It stayed. Not as spectacle. But as realization. And in that realization, something subtle had shifted for everyone who had witnessed it. Not just about fame. Not just about status. But about how quickly judgment can form. And how quietly dignity can hold its ground when it does. The aircraft finally began to move again, but it didn't feel like a simple departure anymore. It felt like a reset that everyone on board was still trying to adjust to. The soft vibration under the cabin floor, the faint hum building from the engines, and the slow push away from the gate marked the return of normal procedure, but nothing about the atmosphere inside first class had returned to normal yet. Victor Harlan sat back in his seat, staring forward now instead of scanning for validation. His earlier confidence had fully collapsed into something quieter and more internal. He wasn't speaking anymore. Not because he had been told to stay silent, but because every word now felt heavier than it had before. Keanu Reeves remained still beside him, looking out the window as the ground slowly shifted beneath them. Taxi lights stretched in long lines across the runway, glowing like small signals in the growing evening light. He didn't appear interested in Victor anymore. Or the crew. Or the passengers still processing what had happened. It was as if the entire confrontation had already been filed away in his mind, finished long before the aircraft even moved. But for everyone else, it wasn't finished. Not yet. Adrian Cole stood near the aisle for a few more seconds, making sure boarding was fully complete and the cabin doors were secured. Only when he was certain did he allow himself to step slightly back, closer to the front, where he could still observe the row without interfering. Mara moved with quiet precision down the aisle, checking seatbelts, confirming trays were secured, but her eyes kept drifting back toward the front section of first class. Something about the shift in energy stayed with her. The earlier tension had been loud and visible. This new tension was quieter, but deeper. The kind that stayed inside people long after the moment passed. Daniel took his position near the front galley, his posture easing slightly now that the immediate conflict had ended, but his awareness remained sharp. Crew members don't fully relax during turbulence, not physical, not emotional. Victor finally broke the silence beside Keanu, but his voice was lower now. Almost hesitant. "I didn't mean," he started. Then stopped again. Keanu didn't turn immediately. He let the silence sit between them for a moment before responding. "I know," he said calmly. That was all. No expansion. No explanation. No emotional weight added to it. Just two words that neither excused nor condemned. Victor swallowed slightly. His hands moved once on the armrests, then stopped. For the first time since boarding, he wasn't trying to shape the moment. He was trying to understand it. The aircraft turned slowly onto the main runway. The engines increased their tone slightly, a deeper vibration filling the cabin as final clearance was given. Inside, passengers shifted subtly in their seats. Some adjusted belts. Others stared forward. A few still occasionally glanced toward first class, where the earlier confrontation had taken place like a silent mark in their memory. A man a few rows back leaned toward his companion. "That's him," he whispered again, quieter this time. "It really is Keanu Reeves." His companion nodded, but didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because the moment no longer felt like something to comment on. It felt like something to respect. Keanu's presence, now fully recognized, didn't change how he behaved. That, more than anything, seemed to settle into people's minds. There was no shift in his posture, no performance, no acknowledgement of status. Just the same quiet stillness he had carried since stepping on board. Victor noticed that too. And it unsettled him more than the recognition itself. Because fame should have created distance. Attention. Reaction. But here, it hadn't changed Keanu at all. It had only changed how everyone else saw him. The aircraft paused at the runway threshold. A brief moment of stillness. The final check before takeoff. Inside that pause, Victor finally spoke again, but not to argue. Not to defend. Just to admit something small. "I didn't know who you were," he said again, softer this time. Keanu turned slightly toward him now. "Not fully. Just enough." "I know," he repeated. Victor nodded slowly, as if that confirmation somehow mattered. "I shouldn't have spoken like that," he added. This time, he didn't stop mid-sentence. The words came out fully formed, but not polished. Not rehearsed. Just honest in their imperfection. Keanu looked at him for a moment longer than before. There was no triumph in his expression. No satisfaction. No need to extend the moment. That's okay, he said quietly. Not forgiveness in a dramatic sense. Just release. Victor blinked once, absorbing that answer in a way that didn't feel immediate. It landed differently than he expected. He had braced for distance. For coldness. For consequence. But instead, there was none of that. Just calm acknowledgement. The aircraft engines rose in power. The plane began its takeoff roll. Outside, the runway lights blurred slightly as speed increased. Inside, the cabin pressed gently into its seats as forward motion built steadily. Victor looked forward now, no longer speaking. But something inside him had shifted again. Not fully repaired. Not resolved. But changed enough that he no longer seemed to occupy the same mental space he had earlier. Keanu remained focused on the window as the aircraft lifted off the ground. A subtle rise. A smooth separation from the earth. The city lights below began to spread out like scattered stars. The moment of confrontation was now behind them physically, but its meaning lingered inside the cabin like a quiet echo that no announcement could erase. Adrian, still near the front, finally allowed his posture to relax slightly. Not fully. But enough to indicate control had been restored. Mara exhaled softly as she returned to her assigned position. Her eyes moved once more toward Keanu, then away again. There was nothing more to fix. Nothing more to correct. But the memory of how easily dignity had been challenged stayed with her. Daniel adjusted his stance near the galley, watching the cabin settle into its flight rhythm. And in first class, two passengers sat in silence beside each other. One still learning the weight of his own actions. The other unchanged by them. Outside, the plane climbed higher into the evening sky. Inside, something quieter than turbulence remained. Understanding, slow, incomplete, but beginning to form. The aircraft had fully left the ground now, but inside the cabin, the emotional weight of what had happened still hadn't settled into something stable. The seatbelt signs glowed softly above each row, casting a faint amber light over faces that were still quietly replaying the moments from earlier. First class, which had once carried the calm confidence of luxury, now felt more restrained. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. People weren't just sitting anymore. They were processing. Victor Harlan stared forward, his hands resting on his thighs. The earlier arrogance that had defined his presence had faded completely. What remained was something quieter, more internal, as if he was no longer trying to control how others saw him, but instead trying to understand how he had ended up here. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained still, his attention once again on the window. The world outside had changed shape. Runway lights now shrinking below, replaced by the deepening colors of the sky as the aircraft climbed higher into flight. There was no performance in him. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. That silence, more than anything, made him feel distant from the chaos that had briefly surrounded him. Victor shifted slightly in his seat. This time, not out of irritation, but discomfort within himself. "I keep thinking about what I said," he admitted quietly. The words weren't directed at the crew. Not at the cabin. Just into the space beside him. Keanu didn't turn immediately. He let the silence exist for a moment before responding. "Okay," he said gently. That single word didn't dismiss him. It didn't excuse him. It simply gave him space to continue if he wanted to. Victor exhaled slowly. "I was wrong," he added, more clearly this time. The cabin around them remained quiet, but not unaware. A few passengers subtly adjusted in their seats. Not to listen louder, but because the tone had shifted again. Something had moved from confrontation into reflection. Keanu finally turned his head slightly toward Victor. Not fully. Just enough to acknowledge him. "It happens," he said. Victor looked at him, almost searching for something sharper in that response. But there wasn't any. No punishment hidden behind it. No superiority. Just calm acceptance of something human. That made Victor more uncomfortable than anger would have. Because anger would have given him something to push against. This didn't. Mara walked slowly down the aisle again, her movements controlled and professional, but her eyes softened slightly as she passed first class. The situation was no longer active, but it was still present in the atmosphere. Daniel remained near the front galley, speaking quietly into the intercom system, confirming flight stability and crew readiness. Everything was now returning to routine, but no one was behaving as if it were just another flight. Because it wasn't. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of orange and blue, slowly blending as the aircraft gained altitude. The city below was now distant, almost abstract. Lights becoming patterns rather than places. Inside, Victor spoke again. "I judged you before I knew anything," he said. "That's what I did." Keanu listened without interruption. Victor continued, his voice quieter now. "I saw your clothes. Your bag. And I just decided what kind of person you were." A pause. "That's not something I usually do," he added, almost as if he needed to believe that part himself. Keanu finally turned his head a little more toward him. "You're not the first person," he said calmly. Victor frowned slightly. "That doesn't make it right," he replied. Keanu nodded once. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." That exchange hung in the air longer than expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. Stripped of performance. Stripped of defense. Just truth. Victor looked down at his hands again. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how quickly I turned it into something about you, instead of something about me." Keanu watched him quietly now. There was no interruption. No correction. Just presence. Victor continued, voice lower. "I made it about where you belonged. Instead of how I was acting." A pause again. "That's on me." The words didn't come easily. They weren't smooth. But they were real. Keanu leaned back slightly in his seat, still calm. "Most people don't stop to notice that," he said. Victor let out a short breath, almost like a half-laugh without humor. "Maybe they should," he replied. For the first time, there was no tension between them. Not friendship. Not comfort. But something quieter, recognition of reality without resistance. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft stabilized at cruising altitude. The earlier energy had fully dissolved now, replaced by the steady hum of flight and the soft rhythm of movement as passengers adjusted into long-haul comfort. A flight attendant passed through first class, offering drinks in a gentle, routine voice. No one reacted dramatically anymore. The system of the flight had reclaimed its space. But inside Victor, something was still shifting. He looked toward Keanu again. "I didn't recognize you," he said once more, softer than before. "But even if I didn't know your name, that shouldn't have mattered." Keanu met his gaze briefly. "It usually doesn't," he said. That answer stayed with Victor longer than anything else. Because it wasn't about him. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about this flight. It was about something simpler, and harder. How people choose to see each other before they understand them. Victor leaned back fully into his seat this time. Not in pride. Not in defeat. Just in acceptance that the moment could no longer be undone. "I'll remember this," he said quietly. Keanu turned his gaze back toward the window. "I'm sure you will," he replied. And that was where the conversation ended. Not with resolution. But with quiet understanding that some moments don't disappear after they pass. They stay. Not as punishment. But as memory that changes how a person moves forward. The aircraft had settled into its cruising rhythm now, that steady, almost hypnotic hum that usually signals the beginning of calm. But inside the cabin, calm didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers, slowly replacing tension, then reflection, then something closer to quiet understanding. First class no longer felt like a stage where something had just happened. It felt like a space trying to recover from it. Victor Harlan sat differently now. Not slouched, not defensive, not rigid with pride, but simply still. His hands rested without tension, his gaze no longer scanning for approval or challenge. It was the posture of someone who had finally stopped arguing with the moment and started listening to it instead. Keanu Reeves remained beside him, unchanged in presence, unchanged in tone, as if the turbulence of human emotion had never been directed at him at all. His attention returned to the window, where the world outside had turned into vast stretches of fading light and open sky. Between them, there was silence, but it was no longer sharp. It was softer now. Less like resistance, more like space. Victor finally broke it again, but this time there was no edge in his voice. "I keep replaying it," he said quietly. Keanu didn't turn immediately. He let the words exist fully before responding. "Most people do," he said. Victor nodded slightly, as if that was both expected and uncomfortable at the same time. "I wasn't angry at you," he admitted. "Not really. I think I was angry at how I assumed things without thinking." A pause followed. "The kind that feels heavier when it's honest. I saw you as someone who didn't belong there," he continued, "and I didn't even question why I thought that." Keanu finally turned his head slightly toward him. "And now?" he asked simply. Victor exhaled through his nose, a faint expression of discomfort crossing his face. "Now I can't stop thinking about how quickly I made that judgment," he said. "And how confident I was about it." Keanu listened without interruption. Not because he was waiting for a response, but because he wasn't trying to steer the conversation anywhere. Victor continued, his voice lower. "It's strange," he said. "You didn't raise your voice once. Not once. And somehow, I was the one who looked out of place." That line lingered in the space between them. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, still calm. "Loudness doesn't always mean certainty," he said. Victor nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I thought it did," he admitted. From the aisle, Mara passed again, this time slower, her attention briefly catching the two men in row 2. The tension that had defined that space earlier was gone. What remained looked like something far more fragile, but also more real. Daniel stood near the front galley, quietly observing the cabin. His job was no longer about intervention. It was about ensuring the flight continued without disruption. But even he could sense that something in first class had shifted beyond operational concern. It had become human. Victor leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer fixed on anything in particular. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he added. Keanu glanced at him. "About what?" he asked. Victor hesitated briefly. "That it happens," he said. "When I said I judged you, and you said it happens." Keanu nodded once. "It does," he repeated. Victor frowned slightly. "But it shouldn't be normal," he said. Keanu didn't disagree. "No," he said calmly. "But it is common." That distinction stayed in the air for a moment longer than expected. Victor looked toward the aisle, where passengers occasionally passed, but now with quieter movements. No one was looking at him anymore. Not like before. Not with judgment. Not with alignment. Just passing through their own thoughts. He turned back to Keanu. "I didn't expect you to respond like this," he said honestly. Keanu raised a slight eyebrow. "Like what?" he asked. Victor searched for the right words. "Like you didn't need to win," he said finally. Keanu paused for a moment, then looked back out the window. There wasn't anything to win, he replied. That answer seemed to unsettle Victor more than anything else had. Because it removed the entire structure he had been building around the situation, the idea of conflict, of sides, of outcome. There had been no battle. Only behavior. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees for a moment. I think I've spent too much time reacting, he said. To people. To situations. To how I think things should be. A pause. And not enough time just noticing them. Keanu listened quietly. Outside, the sky had deepened further. The aircraft cut through a smooth layer of clouds, the last traces of sunset dissolving into night. The cabin lights reflected faintly on the windows, blending interior and exterior into a soft blur. Inside that blur, something had changed between the two men. Not friendship. Not resolution. But understanding without friction. Victor straightened again, his voice softer. I don't expect this to mean anything to you, he said. But I am sorry. For what I said. For how I said it. Keanu turned his head slightly toward him. I hear you, he said. That was all. No acceptance demanded. No apology stretched into performance. Just acknowledgement. Victor nodded once, then leaned back into his seat fully. This time, he didn't speak again. The cabin continued its steady rhythm. Soft lighting. Gentle movement. The quiet presence of passengers slowly settling into the long hours ahead. Mara completed another pass through the aisle, her pace now completely normal. The earlier incident was no longer active in procedure, but it still existed in memory. Daniel stepped briefly into first class, exchanged a short look with Adrian near the front, and then returned to his station. Whatever needed to be managed had already shifted into a different phase. And in row 2, the silence between Keanu Reeves and Victor Harlan remained. But it was no longer heavy. It was simply quiet. A quiet that no longer demanded explanation. The aircraft moved smoothly through the night sky now, steady and unshaken, as if nothing unusual had ever happened inside it. The hum of the engines had become almost invisible again, blending into the background of soft cabin lighting and quiet movement. But inside first class, something had changed permanently. Not loudly. Not visibly. But in the way people carried themselves after witnessing something they couldn't unsee. Victor Harlan sat in silence for a long time. Not the uncomfortable silence he had worn earlier, and not the defensive silence from before that, but a reflective one. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the window, then back to the seat in front of him, then down to his hands. It was as if he was trying to understand the version of himself that had spoken so confidently only hours ago. Beside him, Keanu Reeves remained unchanged. Calm, grounded, present, but not absorbed by the moment anymore. His attention had fully returned to the quiet expanse outside the window, where the sky stretched endlessly, deep and uninterrupted. The contrast between them was no longer sharp. It was just clear. Victor finally spoke again, but this time there was no hesitation or need for validation. Only reflection. I used to think, he said quietly, that confidence meant being certain about people quickly. Keanu didn't turn immediately. He allowed the words to settle. Victor continued. Like if I could identify someone fast enough, I was, in control of the situation. A faint, almost self-aware exhale followed. But I wasn't in control. I was just, guessing loudly. Keanu finally turned his head slightly toward him. He didn't interrupt. Victor looked at him now, not with pride or defensiveness, but with something more honest. I misjudged you, he said simply. Completely. A pause. And I made that judgment public. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't try to fix what had already happened. They just acknowledged it. Keanu nodded once. People do that, he said quietly. Victor shook his head slightly. Yeah, he replied. But it still shouldn't feel so easy. Keanu looked back out the window for a moment. Easy things are usually the ones we don't question, he said. That line stayed between them longer than anything else in the conversation. Victor leaned back slowly into his seat again, no longer trying to fill the space with explanation or justification. For the first time, he was simply sitting with it. The realization. The discomfort. The memory. Mara passed through first class one final time, her movements now fully returned to routine. She checked seatbelts, confirmed service readiness, and offered quiet professionalism to passengers who no longer felt tension in their posture. But as she moved past row 2, her eyes briefly met Keanu's. There was a moment, small, unspoken. Not recognition anymore. Not surprise. Just respect. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod before continuing forward. Daniel stood near the front, speaking softly with Adrian Cole. The purser's posture had relaxed, though his awareness hadn't. The situation had long since resolved operationally, but its emotional impact still lingered in the cabin like a fading echo. Adrian glanced once toward row 2. Everything had stabilized. But nothing had been forgotten. Victor shifted slightly again, then spoke one last time, quieter than before. I don't expect anything from you, he said to Keanu. Not forgiveness. Not even a response. Keanu turned slightly toward him. Victor continued. But I think I understand something now that I didn't before. Keanu waited. Victor searched for the right words, then settled on simplicity. People aren't always what we assume in the first 5 seconds of seeing them. Keanu nodded slowly. No, he said. They're not. That was all. No correction. No expansion. No lesson beyond what was already said. The aircraft continued its steady path through the night. Outside, the world was now a quiet field of darkness and scattered city lights far below. Inside, passengers had settled into the long stretch of flight ahead, most unaware that something small but significant had just passed through their shared space.